the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, not new. It's been going on a long time, obviously took on a new dimension, and the globe has been refocused on it in the last several months.
Yeah.
One of the questions being asked in capitals all around the world is the feasibility now of a two-state solution, given the events of the last, let's call it the last year.
Yeah.
You're about as educated on this region and have looked at it as closely as anybody. Where do you feel we are in the path towards a two-state solution?
Yeah, I'm sorry to say that's probably true. I have spent a lot of time on it. Um, all right, so I mean, let's step back for a second and talk about what we're talking about. Let's talk about the context in which the two-state solution is viable or not viable. You have this single piece of land between the river and the sea, which is basically the British mandatory area of Palestine. After the First World War, the British and the French carved up the Middle East between them into zones of hegemony or imperial control called mandates. They got the League of Nations to sign off on this, even though the Arab countries that were involved in the Arab revolt against the Ottoman Empire thought they were going to be independent and had documents, especially from the British, guaranteeing that they would be independent. They weren't. And the British really wanted Palestine, and the French didn't, so they got Palestine. They drew a border for the Palestine Mandate, and that has now become reified. It's only 100 years old, and yet it has become sacred. It is what many religious Israelis now call Eretz Israel, the Holy Land of Israel. They've allowed the British to divine their kind of patrimony from God, so to speak. And then there are Palestinians who have developed their own national narrative where this is historic Palestine and it's historically Arab, and it was more than 95% Arab when the British took control, and over that period between World War I and World War II became much, as a large Jewish community was formed and ended up in 1948 being more than 25% of the country, but demanding a partition with more than half of the country given to them. And so the idea of dividing this country was never positive from a Palestinian point of view, even though they would have been wise to accept the partition and try and make it work. I doubt it would have. But they would have been wise to at least try that, because they did not have the military strength to prevent the creation of the State of Israel and the concomitant dispossession and exile of 80% of the Arabs in the area that became Israel. But what you've ended up with then is 100 years of conflict and contest and confrontation between two ethno-national groups with competing and mutually exclusive ethno-national projects for total control of this little area between the river and the sea, British Mandatory Palestine. And throughout, you've had differing, percentages of population, but for a long time, it's been in this area that in 1967 was reunited. It got broken up in 1948 with significant chunks falling under the control of different Arab countries, especially the West Bank and East Jerusalem falling under Jordanian control and the Gaza Strip falling under Egyptian control. But less than 20 years later, that was reversed with the 67 war, and Israel was once again in possession of all of mandatory Palestine, plus the Sinai Peninsula and the Golan Heights. They returned the Sinai Peninsula to Egypt in the peace treaty. They have annexed the Golan Heights from Syria. And the Trump administration signed off on that, making our lecturing of Russia about Ukraine a little bit more hollow, to say the least. You can throw in Western Sahara as well. The U.S. has seemed to back Morocco's claims to have annexed Western Sahara in the same way. And in exchange, specifically, for their normalization of relations with Israel. So it appears that Israel is the great carve-out from the UN Charter's prohibition on the acquisition of territory by war, and it can extend to other countries in the name of Israel. No, to guarantee Israel's security. Then Morocco can be a carve-out too. So these two peoples have been struggling for land and power for the past 100 years, and really for the, in an armed way for the past 80 years, and under Israeli control for the past 60 years, a little more. And there are equal numbers of Arabs and Jews in this territory, roughly 7 million of each. And the problem is that all of the Jewish Israelis, wherever they are in this de facto Greater Israel in mandatory Palestine, um, are citizens with all the rights and responsibilities and protection of civil law and everything. Most of the Palestinians are not. 2 million are citizens of Israel, and they face significant discrimination in many areas, but they also have political rights and a vote and representation. And they have access to the government that rules them, um, albeit in a certain circumscribed way, but they do. The 5.5 million in the West Bank and Gaza do not, and in East Jerusalem. They are a very sui generis group of people because they're in their own country, they're in their own place, but they are not citizens of anything. They're not citizens of Israel, nor citizens of their own state, nor nothing. And so this is really now driving the conflict. Is really the people don't talk about this enough, but it's a Palestinian quest for citizenship that has been for the past 25 years, 30 years, been driving their national struggle. The Israeli government has increasingly moved towards, and the Israeli polity as a whole, has been increasingly moving away from a two-state solution, which they dabbled with during the Oslo era in the early 90s, but never really moved much towards, um, and towards annexation. And then the question is, what do you do with the Palestinians there? So the only way to end the conflict and resolve it in a mutually acceptable fashion is a formula that would allow for self-determination of both these peoples, right? So that Jewish Israelis could have their own self-determination in their own Israeli or Jewish state, and Palestinians could also get self-determination, either through a binational state with Israelis, which I think is not workable at all, or through their own state, which Israel is increasingly making impossible. And by the way, baked into, this is the last thing I'm going to say, baked into the current coalition agreement is a statement, a flat out statement that for this government, the current Netanyahu government, only Jews have a right of sovereignty and self-determination in Eretz Israel. Right? That's the word they use. Now, that's superfluous if they were talking about Israel, the state. That's already established by the nation state law that was passed a few years ago. And the term for the Israeli state is Medinat Israel. But they didn't say Medinat Israel, they said Eretz Israel, which is the land of Israel. And it's obvious they didn't say Medinat Israel because they don't mean the state of Israel, they mean the whole shebang. They mean Israel and East Jerusalem and the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. They're clear on that. So they are categorically opposed to a two-state solution. Now, on the other side, the Palestinians recognized Israel. The PLO is the only group that speaks for the Palestinians internationally. Even Hamas recognizes that. We can talk about all that. That's important. But they recognized Israel in 1993. The core of Israeli-Palestinian diplomacy, the navel, the originating point of it, is a letter sent by Yasser Arafat in his capacity as chairman of the PLO to Yitzhak Rabin, Prime Minister of Israel, recognizing Israel and its right to live in peace and security, free from threats, etc. And Rabin replied with, as Prime Minister of Israel, with a letter to Arafat as chairman of the PLO, recognizing the PLO as a legitimate interlocutor and undertaking to negotiate with it. That does not, so Israel has never recognized the Palestinian right to a state, let alone a Palestinian state. And right now, that's a big bone of contention with Saudi Arabia and a potential triangular deal with the United States. It looks pretty grim for a two-state solution. But what I want to say is, unless we, the Israelis, the Palestinians, the international community, want this conflict to continue indefinitely with more October 7s and worse, and more Gaza conflicts and worse, we're going to have some version of a two-state solution, whether it's two broken states, like in former Yugoslavia, Croats here, Serbs there, and they exchange embassies, or whether it's in a confederation or some other hybrid model. the war will not end until Palestinians get citizenship and Palestinians have some means of expressing their self-determination, and not in Jordan, in Palestine itself. So I'm going to end there. I'm going to say the idea doesn't go away because it's the only workable formula to end the conflict through agreement. Otherwise, you get more death and dying, and there's no way out. Every other formula, whether it's Israel's totalizing greater Israel with very few Palestinians given rights, or Hamas's dream of an Islamic state from the river to the sea, or any other formulation, it doesn't work. Or even a single state with everyone voting and everyone happy and brothers and all that. But there's no narrative for it. There's no name for it. It's not workable in this generation or the next generation. So a two-state reality is the only one that can end the conflict by agreement.